Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to Brown University Library. I am Joe Mizell. I'm the university librarian, and it's my great pleasure to see you all here. The library is a place of scholarship, creativity, and innovation, and all those things are going to be on full display in Renee Ater's talk this afternoon. It exemplifies these values we have. And this is part of a sort of larger identity, or reflects larger identity of the library. Brown's library has been pioneering for many years in the area of digital scholarship, and very recently, we have also been advancing an innovative program in born digital scholarly publication. And the person who has been spearheading that effort, who will also be introducing our presenter today, is Allison Levy, who is the library's digital scholarship editor. And Allison herself is an accomplished author and editor, author of 2 books and editor of 3, plus a publication series. So an incredibly accomplished talent that we have brought into the library successfully here and is doing fabulous work. And one of the things we like to do is, in addition to the work we're doing, bring other innovative work that's exploring the possibilities of digital publication to the library so that we can learn from that and also contextualize our work here. So without further ado, I will introduce Allison, who will then introduce our speaker today. So thank you again and welcome. Allison.
Thanks, Jill. Welcome, everyone. Great to see you here. I'm very pleased to introduce Renee Ater and to thank her in advance for what I know is going to be a spectacular talk for all of us. Renee is Associate Professor Emerita of American Art. She has taught in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at the University of Maryland from September 2000 to her retirement, congratulations, in July 2017. She holds a BA in Art History from Oberlin and an MA and Ph.D. in Art History from Maryland. Renee's research and writing have largely focused on the intersection of race, monument building, and national identity in 19th and 20th century American art. And in Renee's own words, I pulled this from your website, I hope you don't mind me quoting you, I am passionate about three-dimensional form. As a fellow art historian, I can appreciate that language. Passionate about three-dimensional form, monuments, statues, and public art. Standing in public space, I like to sort out a monument's relation to the landscape and geography. Both artistic vision and the presence of history and monumental form interest me. Along with this, I'm fascinated with how ceremonies and political events imbue monuments in public spaces with meaning, and how that meaning shifts and mutates over time. Currently a senior fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., Renee is at work on a digital project entitled Contemporary Monuments to the Slave Past: Race, Memorialization, Public Space, and Civic Engagement, in which she investigates how we visualize, interpret, and engage the slave past through contemporary monuments created for public spaces. Through an examination of 25 monuments in the South, Midwest, and Northeast, Renee tells a diverse story about our engagement with the slave past. Arranged thematically, her digital book project considers 6 case studies that include monuments to the transatlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage, slavery and the university, resistance to enslavement, Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, Black soldiers and the Civil War, and emancipation and freedom. Her research is predicated on the idea that the memorialization of slavery is plural and multivocal, and is rooted in the interwoven nature of the social, the historical, and the spatial. Contemporary Monuments to the Slave Past has been funded by an NEH Mellon Fellowship for Digital Publication, by the Getty Research Institute, and currently by the Smithsonian Institution. Renee has published a monograph on the Jamaican-born painter Keith Morrison in the David C. Driscoll series of African American art, 2005, and Remaking Race and History, the sculpture of Meta Warwick Fuller, published with California in 2011. Renee will now discuss her newest book project, The Born Digital: Contemporary Public Monuments to the Slave Past. Please help me in welcoming Renee.
Thank you very much. So I have to say that whenever I hear someone describe the project, I think, wow, I am overly ambitious. So to hear you actually lay that out. So what I'd like to do today is just to walk you through the kind of the process of arriving at this project. It's very, has a particular kind of trajectory that I'd like to kind of trace out for you, as well as if we have time to show you a little behind the scenes into both my Omeka collection management system, as well as a scalar publication that I'm working on. And I've used some other tools as well that I will, if we have time, I can show you, and if you have interest. So let's start not in the digital, actually. Let's start with a monument. So I wrote my dissertation in 2000 on Meta Warwick Fuller. And this piece, W.B. Du Bois hated it when Fuller delivered it to the National Emancipation Exposition in 1913 in New York City. He didn't like the nudity, and he wanted a much more kind of heroic, allegorical representation. But it got me thinking, this is one of those things when you're writing a dissertation, you keep a whole nother subfolder that's like, when I'm done, I'm actually going to work on something else. This was in a folder to think about representations of emancipation, and were there many of these kinds of memorials that existed. But I also thought, are there more monuments to slavery? There seems to have been this moment of kind of drop-off. And I always say it was Thomas Ball's monument with Lincoln and the crouching slave that seemed to kind of lay low any desire to build these kinds of monuments. But she created this, and it was never installed. It was in plaster format, housed at the National Museum of African American History I know I'm getting this wrong, in Boston. But they planned this memorial to Harriet Tubman. And so they cast the plaster in bronze in 1999, and it's in the same park on the south end of Boston with Step on Board, this memorial to Harriet Tubman. And I remember standing in front of this when it was first created and thinking, gosh, I don't know that much about Harriet Tubman. Right? I knew a lot about Sojourner Truth because my mom had given me a book as a child, a biography of Sojourner Truth, but I knew very little about Harriet Tubman. So I started to collect all of the stuff about Harriet Tubman and monuments to her, and there was another folder with the potential for another future project. And then I started actually to think a little harder about slavery and monuments in public space in the United States in particular. So a friend of mine, Cynthia Mills, who's now deceased, was the editor of a journal called American Art. And Cindy said, Renee, I'm doing a special issue on sculpture. Please write about Meta Warwick Fuller. And I was like, are you kidding? I just wrote a book. I have nothing else to say about her. Can I please do something else? And she said, sure. So I took the opportunity to say, well, I've been kind of shoring up this material here. Let me consider this idea of slavery and its memory in public monuments. So I wrote it was just a commentary. It was 3,000 words, very short, but it actually started this project, was this very short commentary. This is, and notice the date, it's spring 2010. And I was someone who, to be honest, did a ton of service in my department and found myself really unable to actually proceed with my scholarship fully. But I wrote this in 2010, and there were 3 memorials that I kind of picked out that I want because they do very different things. One was Mike Walsh's Middle Passage Monument, which is now the original one, is at the bottom of New York Harbor. So I started to think, like, what does it mean if we can't actually see the monument? What does that do for us? What kind of stories? Where's the role of memory in relationship to a monument being sunk to the bottom of New York Harbor? So the plan for this is really very interesting. With the Middle Passage Monument, there was an enormous ceremony in New York. They sailed out to the harbor in a replica of a sail ship and then lowered it down to the bottom of the ocean with about 100 people on board the ship as witness. So I started to think about how does memory work then if it's housed in these 100 individuals who witnessed this moment, and started to think a little more deeply about this. So the plan was that there would be replicas of this all along the Atlantic basin. Like every kind of place where there was where the slave trade had transpired, that there would be a monument. And I think there's still, I was actually looking this up recently, I think there's still a push for this. But there was a replica was dedicated in 2000 in St. Croix. And so this idea of the abstract form and the notion of this kind of very intense celebration and location of this in the ocean kind of roused my curiosity. Then I also was really interested in this, what I consider to be a completely ineffectual monument on many levels, and we can come back to it. But it's Dorothys Bradley's The African American Monument that was created in Savannah, Georgia. And this monument was meant to actually honor the slave trade and the slave past in Savannah. But it does so through a really odd conceit of kind of the nuclear family in modern dress, and with chains broken around their feet, right? And then there's a very interesting quote by Maya Angelou. But this monument, from the very beginning, people were dissatisfied. You can still see it in Savannah. But it also aroused kind of the neo-Confederate voices in Savannah. And there is a whole stream of kind of really vitriolic discussion on the blogs related to this monument. It just got people outraged. And I thought, wow, it's a pretty passive-looking monument. What is it that's stirring up all this? And it's, in some ways, not the monument. It's unresolved racial politics in Savannah, but the monument stands in for that, right, in interesting ways. So that's the second object that I kind of looked at. And then I actually looked at the design for kind of a conceptual space. So one is a memorial that we can't see. One is a figurative monument that is in a place. And the other was this planned conceptual space in Raleigh to acknowledge slavery in the state. And they were going to call it the North Carolina Freedom Monument. What's really interesting, since I wrote an article on this in 2012, 2013, is that this whole design has been completely scrapped, and they've started the design process over again. And I'm not quite sure what's going on with that. But the point of this is that you would enter through this kind of remarkable space where you are experiencing through these kind of conceptual spaces, slavery, but with this trajectory that you're going to end at freedom. And one of the ways that they designed this space, interesting enough, is they held focus groups across the state. They invited 6 communities, white, black, brown communities, to talk about slavery and North Carolina and how the state should begin to wrestle with this legacy at a level that's really about citizen participation. So this is a really key idea. This is now, as I said, has gone by the wayside, but it was an interesting, I think the major issue was raising funds, as usual, for any and all of these monuments. So I started out there, thinking about, in a very tiny little way, about slavery. And then I thought, you know what, I need to think about this much broader than this kind of essay that I wrote. And I started to think about really creating a Born Digital project. And this comes out of my experience working at the University of Maryland. So I was the faculty member who was overseeing all of our graduate assistants in the collaboratory and supervising digital projects, even though at that point I didn't have much vocabulary to be doing that work, but that's what I was doing. And I learned a lot. So one of the big things we did at Maryland for several years, I mean this goes back almost 10 years, is we did a lot of mapping projects at Maryland. And I got a grant to map to maps of Africa. I'm trained as Americanist, but I actually have a minor in African art, and so I taught the African Survey, right? So you know how you end up in these classes that you never envision you're going to teach. And I taught the African Survey for 20 years. So I came up with these interactive maps, and students, particularly at Maryland, just were having a hard time visualizing the continent, but also visualizing ancient empires and the objects related to those ancient empires. And so we did a lot of really interesting things around trade routes, around objects pinned onto the maps. And so this actually and I've always, to be honest, since I was a kid, been obsessed with maps. It's long, I used to collect maps as a child. And so and play like geography games with my siblings, all of these things. So it made sense I was setting this up. And then I encountered this guy here, Mathew Lincoln. And to be honest, he kind of changed my life. He was a graduate student. He didn't work with me necessarily because he worked with Arthur Wielik. He was a Dutch scholar. But he took Albert Doer's journal from his trips to the Netherlands and he mapped it and discovered all sorts of quirky things that people had not been able to resolve about Albert Doer's travels through the Netherlands by simply taking the journal and translating it and putting it on a map. So that things like, why would he go there when he couldn't have gone straight? Well, the river was flooded at that moment, he discovers, and he kind of maps that. So, and Matt also was someone who struggled between deciding if he wanted a Ph.D. in art history or to go into computer science. So he had all the skill set to basically write code. And so he wrote the code for this, and then he did a little project for me. So I'm building up to how I got to this, because I had lots of moments of engagement with technology that led me to think about this. So Matt and I got talking one day, and he said, oh, I need to pull a data set. I want to run like some stuff. And I'm like, okay, go pull all the records from the Smithsonian American Art Museum, which is about 50,000 records, and I want you to do this kind of graph. And what this graph told us is something I always knew from teaching, but it actually, it makes it visible, is that we see in American art the rise of portrait painting as a predominant mode, which is the orange line. So starting around really in the 1640s, portraiture, is astounding. It's dominating. And then we see a serious drop-off right before the Civil War. I kind of knew this. I've taught this forever. But when you show this to students, they're like, oh, that's what you're talking about. Now I get it. Because then the class would shift to the rise of landscape painting, in America, which starts around the 1820s. And we see a preference for landscape painting, and then that drops off. And then, of course, there's no abstraction until this moment that it rises, particularly in post-1950. So this seems like a very simple visualization, but it was one that, for many of us who teach this class, you're like, okay, well, we know this. We can see it, but actually pulling the records out of the museum really proved our point about these two very different things that are happening in the discipline of art history. And so this graph is one I always used to incorporate into my American art survey classes. So the students would actually kind of get why the syllabus was shaped the way the syllabus was shaped, to be quite honest. So after Matt kind of was saying, you should think about the digital, there's so much, and I had supervised projects around digital color, for example. We had done projects, not only the Door project, mapping projects, we had done a whole kind of a SketchUp modeling of gallery spaces. I mean, there's lots going on in the collaboratory that kind of got me really thinking about this as well. And then my colleague, Yui Suzuki, said, you should use Scalar for your project. And I said, well, what's that? And this was right when it first came out. And she had a friend who was the first scholar group to go through a training. And she said, I think this is really the tool that you need. Because one of the things that I'm really interested in is a very media-rich project. A project that has geospatial information, that has video, that has audio files, photography, text, and mapping information. So as expansive as I could imagine it to be. And so Scalar, so I kind of thought about Scalar and then said, oh, this is too complicated to learn on my own. I need to go to a workshop. And so I actually kind of put Scalar to the side until I went to a VAT camp at CAA, at the College Art Association. And one of the discussions was Omeka as a platform, as a content management platform. And they actually did a demonstration, and I thought, this is actually exactly where I want to go. I was both interested in creating a database of images, and this has been an incredible effort, but to build a database of monuments to slavery so that other people could use it. And I get emails all the time saying, can you send us a link because we're building a monument and we want to look at other examples. Like, it's really kind of remarkable, this response this has generated. So I started thinking about Omeka, and I was really naive about it to begin with. And I have to say, one of the things I'll talk at the end of the talk, but I actually scratched my first database. I just had it all wrong. We kind of didn't really get what Dublin metadata was about, and so we just dumped information in, and then we're like, oh, this isn't working. So we deleted it and started over with a much more systematic approach. But for me, Omeka was very similar. I had worked as a registrar in a museum, as well as a curator, an assistant curator at the Corcoran. So I had a very good sense of how these TMS, these management systems work. So I wasn't fearful really of doing this. what I did not realize when I started at the beginning of this project is just how much project management and labor goes into creating something of this sort. But I continue to do it regardless. And there are two other things that happened. So Maryland got a $1.3 million grant, and I believe it is from the Mellon Foundation, for something called the African American History, Culture, and Digital Humanities. And this was in 2016. And in 2017, they decided to have a series of incubators. So this semester before I retired, I started to attend these, because I'm like, I need to get all the training I can get. And I took a lot of mapping tutorials with them, but also things like story maps with Ezra. And I'll make a kind of crash course. So I took a lot of just classes on how to figure out how to do this and understanding what the technology was about. So this is particularly filtered through African American studies or Black studies through this initiative. So everything that we're doing in the Digital Humanities Incubators related to folks at Maryland who are working on African American history, literature, culture, visual culture. And so that was got my feet seriously wet doing that. And then I had the really honor of going to the Summer Institute on Objects, Places in the Digital Humanities. So this was a 2-year institute. I did 1 year in 2017, and this last July, we were in our second institute. And we've been really lucky because we actually, for the 3rd year, they assigned kind of a consultant to us. A recent grad who's working in the Duke Wired Lab, who basically every time I run into a coding problem or any kind of issue, I email her, and she walks me through the steps of fixing my problems. So this summer institute was super, super important. It was hands-on training with tools for geospatial mapping, so things like Mapbox we learned how to use, which crashed my computer. That geospatial stuff is something to really think about how much memory you have on your computer. I was telling a group earlier, not only did it crash my computer, and then I spilled a bottle of water on my computer just to top it all off. But we did 3D modeling, mostly through SketchUp. We did photogrammetry, which I'm very interested in the idea of 3-dimensional models of the sculptures that I work on, and which turns out to be a fairly easy tool to use once you kind of master very boringly walking around your object and taking pictures of it. And then things like data collection and visualization. So all of these platforms, Scalar, Omeka, Story Maps, all a range of tools we were taught in these intensive week-long 9-hour day sessions where we then would have a reading group afterwards about the critical issues in the digital humanities. So this was, for me, everything I learned there kind of lit the light bulb, so to speak, and I started working on my project. So what are the themes, first of all, or what I kind of consider the matrix of this? So the project is Contemporary Monuments to the Slave Past. So the first thing that I'm really interested in is race. What is the material form and representation of race in monuments? That's one way of me kind of getting a handle on this, because these monuments are really complicated. Part of the problem with a lot of monument we're building is that they're using 19th century tropes of blackness and 21st century monuments. And this is causing, not for communities isn't causing problems, but as a scholar, I have a lot of issues with how some of these monuments are being built. So this idea of both embodying blackness in public space, like what does that look like, became a core issue. The second thing was just around memorialization. What does it mean to try to both commemorate and remember slavery in some way? How do we talk about this very traumatic, particularly the traumatic nature of slavery, the slave trade, in memorial form? How does that take place? Who is remembering, and why are they choosing to remember this? This is what I should say. I haven't said this explicitly. Communities are remembering slavery. This is people are saying they're not. Communities are doing this on the micro level, having conversations about what slavery means for their communities, and then commissioning monuments to acknowledge it. So this notion of memorialization is key to my project. And then the idea of public space, the notion of both sacred and profane space, and how these various, both, whether it's a university campus with the Martin Puryear monument that you have here at Brown, or if it's something much more visible in public space, where the public space is a neighborhood, if it's a governmental center, if it's a courthouse lawn. I've been looking at a Frederick Douglass Memorial, for example, in Talbot County, that was built to counteract the Confederate memorial that still stands on the East End's courthouse. So how does that space work? It's a space where lynchings took place, and so you stick Frederick Douglass. Does that counter any of the narrative that's happening, let's say, with the Confederate monument that's there? So this idea of that space can be both sacred. When I was at the Getty, I worked on a cemetery in Washington, D.C. that had been desecrated. It was a Freedmen's and Contraband cemetery that they built a gas station on top of in the 50s. Even though when they drilled down they found bones, they just kept building. And then they built another space on top. So they've actually dedicated the cemetery as a sacred space. And so I'm interested in those tensions between public and private, but also between these very sacred and profane issues that get played out, particularly with the kinds of monuments that I'm talking about. And let's see. And lastly, this idea of civic engagement. You know, I've been really interested. It's not for me just individual and community response. So that's important. How are individuals or communities responding to this memorial? How are they responding to slavery? But I actually am really interested in the idea of like civic engagement galvanizing people into action. So I'm looking at the way in which these monuments oftentimes ends up with what some have called afterlives, that they're doing other things that we never imagined. And I think very particular at Lincoln University in Missouri has a monument to the United States colored troops that has become a focal point for political rallies, right? So they're kind of transforming the meaning of that monument from honoring Black soldiers in the Civil War to a rallying space, right, to demand equity and justice and in Missouri. So this notion of civic engagement, you know, the cemetery in Virginia is 2 ladies were furious that they were going to pave it over. And they pestered the state for 10 years. And they started a friends group. They were relentless. Like, these women they were relentless. They got the memorial just by basically bothering everybody they could for a decade. And so that, I'm very interested in how all of these things kind of work together. So how does that play out in the digital? I mean, that's also an interesting idea. So I am very interested in interpretation and narrative. It has a very important role to play in my project. So I'm creating a database that I'm also creating kind of interpretive text to go with it, or a narrative text, or what we might even say kind of an academic text. So the other thing that came to me that I had no idea what I was getting into, I have to say I was a little rosy-eyed about how this, or what's that, rose glasses? I never get these right. Rose-colored glasses? Whatever it was, I was naive when I started this, is what I can say. And they kept saying at the National Humanities Center, project management. I'm like, no big deal. I've written like 2 books. I know how to do this. No way did I know how to do this. And I will be really honest with you. So they gave us this worksheet. And I started to do it. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's a lot to think about in working out how this will look. So whether it's your questions, which I will show you what my questions, what the proposed output, the significance, I had to think really hard about who's my audience. Like, do I have an audience? Am I just doing this for myself? Or do I see this project having a bigger life than that? Serious challenges, which I will talk about at the end. But also things like, what are the expertise I need? What are team, like the notion of collaboration? I actually have a graduate assistant who works for me that I pay out of my pocket 15 to 20 hours a week, because I cannot do this by myself. I learned that super, super fast. But also what's the timeline, the workflow, all of this was really interesting. So although the project was born digital, boy, did I do a lot of paper stuff, okay? So I bought these massive, I don't know if you've ever seen them, I love stickies, and I love giant stickies, and this thing is, and I basically posted them all in my office at home for 6 months. They hung on the walls while I worked out what's the question? Like, what is the goal or question of this project? And the most basic question is, how and why do we visualize, interpret, engage the slave past through contemporary monuments? Why even do this? Why not set up a fund for reparations? Like, why is a monument important, right? And I think Georgetown is trying to sort through what that means. So then I have a whole series of much more narrow questions, not narrow, but that come through it. For example, how is the Black body to be made visible in public space when it's invisible, objectified, or policed in daily life? Like, this is a pretty important question for me, particularly the male body as represented in these monuments. So I had lots of questions, and they go on and on. Okay, so these things, and my husband finally was like, can you please take this down? I think you've sorted out what you are about here. But they're useful because I keep going back to the core questions to remind myself what the point of this project is. And then I did this little, I'm a sticky fan, as I said, so I put stickies on stickies. So I actually see this as not just kind of, I'm doing case study, case study, but that these are all interacting with the main research question, but with each other. That each section of the project will, in fact, be able to relate to the next section of the project. And that became also really important to me, about how that research question relates to each of these six themes, and how they will be realized online. I also did something really, really simple. I printed out a map of the Union and Confederate States, because I wanted to see, like, where were these monuments falling, and I just started to stick red dots. Like, this was really, like, literally, I didn't even have a sticker. These are just drawn on the map. And then we see the border states. But I wanted to start to see, like, where were these fallings? Were there states like Alabama who really aren't wrestling with the story? And why don't they have any monuments? And then I just started to plot out each state in some way to figure, and there's more states actually that we've added, but to think about, like, where, and we can see there's an enormous amount of monuments in the Northeast. And most of the monuments to the Northeast, it's complicated. Some of them are about the slave trade itself, but a lot of them are kind of emancipation monuments, because we want to tell this kind of sanitized story, often in public space, about the Northeast relationship to slavery. So that became interesting, and these are really complicated down here in the South. There are quite a few United States Colored Troop monuments that are down in these southern states, but things like universities trying to, particularly North Carolina, wrestling with the Silent Sam Confederate Monument in relationship to a slavery memorial that was commissioned by a group of students in 2008, I believe. And so thinking about, in very broad ways, both the state, so there's a lot going on. There's geography going on here, right? There's monuments going on, there's artists. And what I discovered, perhaps one of the most interesting things in this project, is that there are actually a group of artists who make monuments in the United States, which I had no idea, that there's kind of 6 men and women who do this work. And they do it mostly in figuration and mostly in realistic figuration. So that was very eye-opening. And then I had to start thinking about, like, proposed output, because the folks at Duke and NHC said I had to start thinking about this. So first of all, everything I do is an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Doc. And then we export them as CSV. So we have very strict kind of protocols for how we manage our data, so to speak. So we have these spreadsheets. I use Omega as the archive, and I'll show it to you in a moment. So I have photos of monuments. I geolocate everything. I have archival documents, and so forth. I also tried Neatline. I'm not a fan, to be honest. It's a plugin. I could not get Neatline to, my graduate student actually created something. I'm still not quite satisfied. So I'm kind of like, there's other tools that do it better, to be honest, for me. And then Scalar as one of the other platforms. So I'm really dedicated to the notion of open source. I want people to be able to get into my database and use the data. And I don't mean, I'm worried actually that this has a whole nother set of issues that I've talked about in relationship to, I've kind of disabled the comment file on my so far, because I'm not quite ready to deal with, to be honest, some of the white supremacist comments that come in related to this material. So I've blocked it for the moment. That's not, will not always be that way. So what's my data, right? My data are these monuments. They are archival objects. But the most important thing about this project management that absolutely slowed me down is that we started an Omeka database that we ditched. And we did it because it was really random. We were just kind of sticking stuff in and, oh, doesn't this look good? And then I was like, hold up, we need like a system here. And so we stopped doing that and we deleted it and we started fresh. And one of the things we did, and I'm going to pass this around because it's, I sometimes think it's insane that I did this. I took the Dublin Core metadata and basically mapped it onto the National Museum of African American History and Culture, their data sets. So I tried to merge these two languages to get them to work. And the reason I did this is I was running into intense problems with the nomenclature from the Library of Congress. And it's about 5,000 years too old and needs to be updated. I call it the tyranny of the Library of Congress in the way that they've shaped the language around Blackness, really. And so I kind of resisted that, and one of the things I did was to take every single field in Omeka and relate it basically to how I was going to very specifically use title and what that meant, and then how it related to the TMS files at the museum. Now this happens because I actually know the person who's the head of the digitization. She's a really good friend from the Corcoran days. And so she passed all that material on to me. So this took us, to be honest, about 6 weeks of hard thinking and sorting out. As an academic scholar who's used to like sitting in the library and getting my books and writing, this was a totally different way of thinking. To think about how do I want to control data and how do I want to, not really control, manage my data. And how is it, for example, I don't ever use the word Negro on my site. Okay, this is a word that lingers on in the Library of Congress, it lingers on in the Smithsonian's database, but I wanted to think about this differently. And so and then, should I pass it this way? So I did this whole, we have these tables and we use them for reference. So I spent a lot of time on paper, if you can see this, before I actually even hit a key and entered a single object. I spent a lot of time thinking about, and partly it's really important for me that I want this database to kind of have sustainability over time. So the data issue becomes really key about how to enter that data, and we have very consistent ways of doing this. Everything down to circa CA period every single time. I also hired recently someone just to come in and clean up the data. So totally separate from the person who's creating and entering it. And so I have a colleague who I've been hiring by the hour, and she used to work in a lab, and this is what she likes to do, and so she does the data cleaning for me. So I have a database now. 82 is not is a total now. My Grace Yasamura is actually probably about to add about 120 more objects to the database. We're having a meeting on Thursday to wrap up the spreadsheets. So in Omeka, we just started by entering objects in the Excel spreadsheet. And I'm going to bounce out in a moment and show you what that looks like. I also use the exhibit function within Omeka to tell a very particular stories about these 6 themes. So one of the first exhibit is about this idea of monument and myth, kind of the mythic idea of Harriet Tubman and how she gets represented in public space. I have a story map. So I'm using a variety of tools here. So StoryMap.js is from Knight Labs at Northwestern, where I've embedded the map. Really nice tool, super easy to use. But to actually layer down so that you can read about the historical Harriet Tubman, trying to in fact do a kind of an encapsulated biography that's not about myth, about like who was this woman and what did she do. And I've read pretty much every biography on her. But also to talk about the Underground Railroad, because almost every single monument in public space to Harriet Tubman is about her work on the Underground Railroad. And not her work as a Civil War, she was a Civil War, I guess you could say, not soldier, but she was a nurse during the Civil War. She was a scout during the Civil War. So this becomes really, and then to kind of tell this story of the monuments and what they can tell us in the inclusion and bibliography. So each exhibit will exist in this kind of mode. This is the neat line, which I'm just kind of like, yeah, but it does tracing Harriet Tubman in the landscape, and it gives us these stories about Harriet Tubman, and you can go from point to point to point and click. It's an interactive map that if you hit on each one of these, it pops up a content box with a photograph that tells you something about Harriet Tubman in that particular space. And then I use this wonderful tool. I swear, this is, when I discovered this was very recently. It's so satisfying, 2 hours, and I end up with this really beautiful thing. This is StoryMap.js. I think I posted it on Facebook. It circulated. What's so fascinating, so I posted this. I'm getting emails from people saying, you didn't include my friend's monument in your timeline. I'm like, what? So it's clear that people are really interested in seeing how these map out. I have a friend who's using it to take a tour with her daughter this summer, which I'd never envisioned that's how it was going to be used. So it takes you from Auburn down to all of the monuments. I also used their timeline function from Night Labs, which is also a really easy way to get at the fact that there's a huge gap from about 1915 until almost the 80s before a monument's built to her, right? So we have an early recognition, and then she kind of falls out of memory, except for in children's books. And there's a dominance of children's books and telling the story of Harriet Tubman through children's books. So I had a timeline. So you can see I've tried a lot of, to be honest, I have tried a lot of different platforms, and I'm very interested and dedicated to open source content. And this is just the opening page of my Scalar page. So that I have a successive of chapters in here. I kind of lay out what the big issue of this project is. This is from the Frederick Douglass Memorial at the University of Maryland, and the back image is from Allison Sarr's Memorial to Harriet Tubman in New York City. But to actually use Scalar what I'm finding now that I also found that I actually had to scratch my original Scalar site as well, which I did on Saturday. I just deleted the whole thing because I totally had screwed up my images and everything. Like one image mistagged made the whole thing collapse, actually. Unfortunately, it was very, very sad. And it's fine. I started over to have a better sense of where I actually have no problem starting over. And I think that you have to really understand that. If you're going to do a digital humanities project, the first time it's not going to be perfect. And I think failure is part of the way that these work. And I think I'll wrap up. Does that seem appropriate? So it's about 4:45? Okay. Yeah. So I'll tell you what my big issues are, and there are a lot of them in doing this. I don't actually regret deciding to do this project this way. I could not envision writing another paper book with a cover and a back that had flat images of three-dimensional objects. Now I know this is also, the internet realm is flat, but I can work with three-dimensional modeling and Google renderings of space. Like there's a lot of ways that I can access three-dimensionality in the project. So one of the big things is failure, this trial and error and experimentation. I have experimented a lot with different platforms and trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. And sometimes I've actually said, this doesn't do what I want to do. I'm just going to move on to the next free platform and see how that works, right? So a lot of it, particularly with mapping, I just have found like working with GIS data and working with it requires a whole next level of thinking. And I've done a little bit of that. Oh, this is so funny. I forgot to read Norm Birthday's. Let's see. Oops, okay, let me go back. So there's an issue here that will pop up last, but it'll come back. So one of it is actually the resources. When I got to the Getty in September, and it was about October, and I thought, oh my gosh, I need a team to do this. So this idea of single Renee, like working really hard on this project is unrealistic. And so one of the things I've been thinking about in the future is actually assembling a team of people to help me write it. Because I will be doing this probably for the rest of my life at this pace. But the collaboration is absolutely essential to any DH project. The time is slow in doing this. It's quite different as well. And then money, and that seems like I've gotten 3 grants, but those are, and to be quite honest, they're individual grants that allow me to do very concrete small pieces of the project. They're not a large kind of institutional grant. And what does that look like? Or what does it look like to fund a project beyond kind of the $50,000 range, right? $50,000 is really good. I'm not knocking it, actually. But this project needs more than that. And I need to pay my research assistants more than that. This has become, and we talked about this at lunch, this is a huge issue for me with the technology. Learning the technology, you kind of learn it. For me, this is not a big issue. My issue is around access and sustainability. The issue of long-term sustainability of the project. Where does it get housed? Who owns it? Do I just keep it on reclaimed hosting till I die? I mean, I don't know. So I've been in conversation with both the Smithsonian and the National Museum of African American History and Culture about the possibilities of hosting it there. Smart History, which is a art history dedicated, is very interested in my work, and we might be able to work something out with them. But that issue of sustainability is something I even after doing those NHC workshops, I don't think I really got until a couple weeks ago when I just kind of sat down and said, what happens to this project when it's end? When there's going to be a deadline, it's going to be done, then what happens to it? Where does it live? Who has access? And by access, for me, this project is a public humanities, or public scholarship project. I am not, and I say this very explicit on the front page, I am not interested in this being behind a paywall at all. It is meant really for kind of a high school and college age level students to actually kind of study this, and for other people. I mean, there is a scholarly argument, but I'm making it in very plain English. I don't use a lot of bells and whistles and theory. I'm pretty straightforward as a scholar. So this is probably my biggest issue that I'm wrestling with right here, is access and sustainability. The peer review process is very interesting. Like, how does that work? I mean, you have kind of you have this lovely editor sitting right here, but how does that work for most of us? So one of the things that Duke is providing right now is the Wired Lab at Duke University within the art history department. They're actually looking at both my Omeka and the Scalar site to give me some feedback. So I feel like that has to be built in, some kind of review process. And particularly, like, are you making an argument? If you are, what is it doing to make this particular kind of argumentation? So let me come back to empathy, because that's a very, very specific to me. And this other kind of fifth thing that I'm really wrestling with is, what does it mean that I'm creating an archive, basically? And both the meaning of creating an archive of this kind of material, where I've decided to use very specific kind of nomenclature where it is about blackness. What does that mean? But also, in relationship to that archive, I am now at the point where we're probably going to crowdsource some of this. We're going to develop a very specific form, crowdsource the data, and we're going to do it through historical societies at the beginning. That's one way that we've been reading a lot about this, and Duke is trying to help me think through this. But I think in order to not get so many emails about why isn't my monument in your project, crowdsourcing is actually a really interesting way of getting the public to know about what this project is. And so we're just starting to talk about that and sort out what that will look like. This is an issue that is totally, in some ways, and there's a woman over in the, who I think is leading me around tomorrow, who's doing a dissertation on empathy. Can't remember who that was, but I thought I read about her. So this idea of empathy came up because I started to look at my images and the photographs I take. And what I realized is that I am trying, and I didn't know I was doing this until I had to do photogrammetry, which is very rote. No artistic photographs, you're just moving, boom, boom, every 5, whatever, less than 5 feet, you're moving around the object. So for me, I realized I was creating empathy and trying to create an empathetic gaze towards the black body. This is just something I think I need to be really aware of when I'm taking these photographs, that I am in fact kind of doing my own intervention in the monument through my photographs, if that makes sense. And that is, I think, really important for me to keep in mind. Someone asked me, I gave a talk a couple weeks ago, and they said, oh, you showed us all these, you segmented the memorial. And I said, well, it would be really impossible for you to see what I'm talking about if I don't show you details, which is art historians use details all the time. It's part of our practice. But this idea, and I don't mean empathy. So you asked me a question about mindfulness. This is where this comes in. Because when I think about empathy, I'm really thinking about that empathetic gaze that to me is not about some German theoretical ideas of empathy, that is more rooted in kind of mindfulness and, to be honest, like meditative practice, contemplative inquiry. So that becomes really key. And I'll see how I sort this out. I mean, I have people always say, who takes your photographs? They're great. And I'm like, well, I take them. And I realize I also have a sort of an agenda with the way I'm taking these photographs. So, and I think if very quickly I can just show you, if you're okay, I can kind of show you inside. Can I do that quickly? So here is, where are the glasses? Are they on the head? Are they, no, in my pocket? Oh, there they are. Sorry. This is can never find them. So I can't quite get into the database because I forgot my login, which is super, super complicated, to be honest, and I couldn't remember to put it in on your computer. So, but what I wanted to show is that if you were to land on my page, what you would see are that we have individual objects, that you can go up here and you can go into the items list, for example, and that basically you can look at, we have everything from sheet music to road markers to engravings to photographs that I've taken of Harriet Tubman's grave. We have archaeological images. We have quite an array of objects in there. So that we have both this kind of database, we have a map that will show you all of the geolocation data, right? So you can come here and see that I've geolocated every single monument, and it relates very specifically to the map, and might be more useful to see it there. And then that we have this, I'm sorry, let's see. I've also started to build collections. So if you're interested in every Harriet Tubman monument that's in the database, you can come to this section and you would find very specific monuments to Harriet Tubman, to United States colored troops, to emancipation, right? So I've created these kind of subcategories. Now, so that's, for me, really important, this whole idea of the exhibit. And I just have one in there for now. But if you were to go into the exhibit, it allows you, as I showed earlier, to kind of drill down. So here's the story map, which is super easy to embed, the story map.js. You just put a code in there, and it allows you to move, right? It's such a simple tool, but it allows, and these are all my photographs, to move from place to place and see where these are located, and then to come down to the eastern shore of Maryland, to Salisbury. So I have been traveling this whole region taking these photographs of these objects. And I also, just because I think some people were really surprised at this timeline, that we have early, so this does kind of the flip. We have these plaques, and then you'll notice the next monument's 1994. So there's a huge amount of time between early representation, which I have something to say about in my interpretation, that takes place really through here, Harriet Tubman in the Memorial Landscape, where I kind of lay out one of the things of me trying to break down this notion of the myth of Harriet Tubman is to look actually at the impact of Sarah Bradford, who wrote these two biographies. And everybody reads them, and everybody takes the false information out of those and applies them to the monuments. It's really rather astounding. And then the second is these 19th century image makers. So there's a whole series of photographs that I put into a carousel that these artists examined. And the problem is that we forget is Harriet Tubman was only in her late 20s, early 30s when she was an Underground Railroad conductor. We always see her depicted as if she's 85 years old, right? There's no way she could have done that in her old age. So part of this is kind of the art historical work I'm doing here to say, well, if we look at these photographs and we look at Bradford, we get a certain kind of public representation of her in monuments. And then I do lots of linking because, I don't want to spend all my text explaining to folks what's a carte de visite, what's an album in print, who's Frederick Douglass, which, comes up. And lastly, it's just here we get a discussion of each of the monuments, and you can kind of drill down into each monument over here where I began to talk about them. And one of the things we talked about scrolling, what was really important for me was to keep my information really compact. Two to three paragraphs, occasionally longer, but I think I read somewhere that you don't want to scroll more than 2 times because you lose people's attention. So I tried to keep information really tight, and so that people would land here and see, and then maybe move on and learn more about these monuments. And scalars, and there you are. And the reason I use this image is because I love that it has footprints all over it, because the day I was here, a child was scaling it, and people were having lunch on it. And so that, to me, is part of the story of what we understand. So this is the scalar site, and again, it is slightly different, partly because I think the kind of language I use can look a little different. So I find myself rewriting some of the text from Omeka. And I do not do a lot of, some of the writing I do immediately inside both of these platforms. I do almost everything in Word and in these spreadsheets, so I have it exterior to the project, because what happens if it dies? I want the text to live somewhere else. I also print out a lot of stuff. So I'm trying to use a lot of means of basically conserving the actual text and argument that I'm making. And I also, just a little plug, I run a blog. So this was another thing that came up. I had never even thought about having a digital presence. And someone's like, you've got to create a website for your work. So I have reneeater.com, but it has my writings, but I've started this blog on monuments. And I'm about to post something, actually. I'll probably work on it maybe on the plane tomorrow. But part of it is a very informal way for me to talk about monuments, and in some ways a very different kind of writing. It allows me a much more first-person, personal experience and relaying of the encounter with the memorial. So one of these was an experience I had down here at the EJI Memorial in Alabama. I was there last year for the opening and talking about feeling kind of emotionally wrecked once I went through this memorial. That's not something that I will probably talk about in the final Scalar publication, but this allows me to use this space to talk about it. So you can see the project is getting really drawn out, and I just point to one last thing. This project absolutely changed the way I thought about my work. So one of the women who was part of my cohort down in North Carolina, she knows Gabriel Foreman and said, you've got to look at the colored conventions and then you got to talk to her. So I realized, like, I went on colored convention, I thought, oh, there's kind of a sweet spot here. She's figured out the right amount of text and balance with images. She's using all of these technologies in interesting ways, and she's using it as a teaching forum, which I'm really, as a pedagogical tool. So both undergraduate and graduate students submit content, which is approved by an editor. But I was just floored, actually, by this project, and so it became a way of modeling my own project. And lastly, there's just one other thing that I have become a little bit obsessed with, and it's this image. This is for the Coastal Survey that took place in the 1860s. And what it is a map showing the distribution of the slave population of the southern states of the United States. So one of the things that was a total side project I'm really interested is taking this map and actually dumping the SPLC data onto it and to see where those Confederate monuments land in relationship to density of slave population in the past and see if there's a correlation. I have no idea, but it seems to me this SPLC, everyone knows that they did this huge data, mapped out all of these monuments, but you can download their data. And Matt Lincoln's like, oh, Renee, contact me, I'll help you do this. So I'm going to contact him and have him write some code for me. But I'm really interested to see that correlation and then perhaps actually then go back and put my own monuments in relationship to those sites as well. So we'll see how that works out. But that is something, this idea of using these big data grabs onto maps are really interesting to me, because I think particularly this map tells us, and you know, I ran into this map because there's a fellow whose desk is next to mine and she had it stuck on the wall. Because she's writing on the Coastal Survey. And I saw this map and I was like, oh my gosh, where did you get this? And she's like, it's the Coastal Survey. So she gave me an essay. But we can see, particularly along here, the Mississippi River, these very dense, right? Along where there's ports, there's waters, we see density. And so I'm very interested to do kind of a correlation between the Confederate and the slave monument. So I think we're out of time. So thank you very much. That was a lot, a whirlwind, but thank you.
Okay. I'm sure there are many. I will open it up to the room.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was going back to your comment on peer review. This is
Yes.
something that we talk a lot about in terms of our project. And so there's the kind of peer review that we're familiar with from the established modes of scholarship about the content. But then there is this new level of peer review in digital projects and publication that it's not about the form, it's about the form as content and the content as form, as it were. And that can be separate or integrated to various degrees with the text part or whatever the traditional kind. So in your experience and wrestling and reiterating your projects, how have you been thinking about those issues? Because there's a lively debate about what constitutes peer review in this sort of scholarly environment.
Yeah, so what Duke is doing actually is to looking at like how basically am I using these tools? And how they're, and I'm not sure they're really looking very carefully at the content. I mean, I think they are, but I think that there's, how am I using Omega to do certain kinds and tell certain kinds of stories? How am I marshaling the database? Like they're considering at that level. And I'll be really interested when they get back to me if they actually talk about the content in relationship to that, right? Because I could see a whole separate group of scholars, and this is really hard. Like I have another group of scholars who are very interested in the project, but they don't want to actually talk about the technology of it. I'm like, well, that's actually kind of a problem because as a DH project, you have to, it's hard to find people who have the experience in DH to actually do both of those pieces together, I think. So we'll see what happens when I get a response back from Duke about what they've really evaluated as far as And I know from Beth Fisher, who I've been working with, a lot of it is, oh, Renee, it looks like you need more white space on the page, or your map link is broken, or you screwed up the CSS code, don't go in there again. You know, those kinds of things, right? So trying to sort those things out. But I also would like a group of sculptural historians to read the content. This is really, really key to me. As someone who is an art historian for 20 plus years, I would like that kind of feedback on how I'm talking about the monuments as monuments, you know, as well. Does that answer you?
No, it's very interesting. It suggests that not only is the production of these kinds of works a team effort, as you say, but then also the kind of review and authenticating procedures that scholars go through also needs to become more of a multi-skilled team effort as well.
Well, I have to tell you, this was really interesting to me. I applied to the National Humanities Center, and I shouldn't even feel bad that I didn't get it because I got funding from other sources, but it was really interesting. And you would think because they were leading these digital DH workshops, there were 2 of our projects that basically they had no one to review who had the skill set. So they felt like they could not pass a judgment on the value of the digital humanities aspect of the project. That's what they told us. And I was floored. And then they asked would I review for the next round of grants of the DH projects, right? Nice. But that's actually an interesting, like here's a humanities center sponsoring multiple years of this DH workshops, yet not actually having the tools to allow a scholar like me to actually go to their humanities center and work on this. I am the first scholar at SAM, at the Smithsonian, who's doing a DH project. Mm-hmm. People are like, wow, you've set like the way for the rest of us, and I had not even thought about that. So I think, and the Getty, interesting enough, did not want me to talk about the DH side. They explicitly said, please just give a traditional scholarly lecture. Right? So here I am like in my office every day working on these various platforms and told, please present it in a way that it's in a traditional format. So I think we have a lot to work out of how this is going to look in the future. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. That was such a great talk. So one thing that I'm really interested in, and I've found, and I'd love it if you talk more about that, is when you showed that graph of how portraiture and how we kind of knew this, but now we know it in a different way.
Yes.
Can you speak to how that process of classifying and categorizing these objects and these memorials helped you think about them in a different way?
Oh, that's actually a really good question, actually, because I had, when you write a book, you worry about all that kind of stuff when you're doing rights and reproductions, like around your object, and you don't think very hard about any of this stuff. I think the very fact that I had to think about nomenclature actually made me think about the sculptures a little bit differently. And I'm not sure I can articulate what that difference is, but because I have all this little microdata about the object, I feel like I know the object in a different way. I know who all the funders are. I know when it was dedicated, when it was commissioned. There's stuff that I might have glossed, quite frankly, if I'd been writing a book, which we do. There's so much pages that we can have in order to talk about this stuff. So I also, and it made me think really hard about how I want to actually talk about Blackness and embodiment in public space. Like, what is the language that I want to use? So that came out of that really like nitty gritty, trying to figure out what and those are still circulating around somewhere, all that nitty gritty stuff. Because once that was done, it forced me in some ways to think about the objects in a different way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I was kind of shocked at that. Because, I have been, you work on your field and you do this stuff and you're writing about monuments and sculpture, but to really start drilling down, for example, I have found a remarkable number of developers in Alexandria, Washington, D.C., and Richmond support monument projects. They're and I was like, I never would have known that if I hadn't created a database category for tracking that. So now I'm sort of like, why is card development doing this? Why is P.N. Hoffman? I mean, part of it's to sanitize their own images, to be really blunt. A monument built where a slave pen used to be. It helps them kind of make good with the community. Some of it's telling stories that are kind of half-truths, actually on the wharf in DC, but these developers are putting their funds into these monuments. And I'm a little concerned because it's actually a particular shaping of history that's very suitable and clean for public digestion. And that's the post that I'm going to blog on. Because the Pearl is a very infamous incident in Washington, D.C., where there was a ship that had something like 200 escaped slaves, came down to the 7th Street Wharf, which is in my neighborhood, and boarded it. And so the developer celebrates this as this great underground railroad moment in D.C., without saying there was a riot, and then they were jailed, and 45 people were sold into deep slavery, and the women were sold into sexual slavery. Like, that gets erased when a developer wants to tell a sanitized story. So that I never knew, to be honest, by doing that kind of recording. And we record every single contributor, not just the artists. Who are the landscape architects? So I start to see that there's mass design keeps popping up. Like, there's certain groups who pop up a lot in this. Rothschilds, I think their engineers show up a lot for monuments. So it's interesting to see who the players are. I use that because that has become a really interesting field about who's involved in the creation and of these, and how city offices are involved in as well. So yeah, it's been significant, actually. Yes, please.
First of all, this talk is amazing. I came here when I saw that it was about how you create your project, because I'm a database administrator by profession.
Okay.
So I was thinking, wow, you really put in the work for somebody who didn't really know about it.
Yes.
Coming up with this. It's really amazing. And also, I wanted to comment about the fact that you talked about how somebody used the map and the viewpoints to now create a vacation.
Yeah.
With their daughter, like how did?
So this was really interesting. So this is my neighbor who's like my biggest fan. Okay, so she like is my follower. I have one follower, and her name is Lisa, and she's constantly emailing me like, "What are you doing now?" and send me the latest article. Like she's great for my ego, actually. So I sent her like little pieces of this because she's super interested in what I'm working on. She's an African American woman who is, and I don't know if she's even a historian by trade, but she's super interested. So when I posted that story map to my Facebook page, and then I posted it to Twitter, Twitter actually ended up having it reposted a lot of times. But then I also just sent it to her, and she actually emailed me back and said, "This is great, where are the addresses?" And I said, "What?" So I went back and put the addresses on for her. So every single one of those things in that story map actually has an address. So one of the things I've been interested in, Omeka has a plugin called Curatescape. So it changes my format, so I haven't quite engaged it yet, but Curatescape allows you to create tours. And so one of the things, although it's very expensive, and because I don't have an academic affiliation, that makes it, well, I do, but not in the same way. So I've been thinking about also how this information might be translated to an app that you can handheld. So I was at a very small DH conference up in Minnesota a couple years ago, and one of the people who spoke is this guy about Cleveland. It's somewhere in here. Is this project, Cleveland Historical, and they were just at the beginning of the project. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. And I saw this model, I was like, this is what I want to do. And too bad, at that point he offered it to me for free, and I could just have the skeleton and drop my stuff in, and I didn't know what that meant, so I was like, oh, I don't need that. Now it costs thousands of dollars to actually use Curatescape. But it allows you to actually map out tours. So what I could do is take that story map and drop it in here, and then she could have an app and just use it that way if she wanted to. But she's going to take the story map, and I don't know if she's going to have it on her phone, but she's like, we are taking a drive across the country, and we're going to every one of these sites, which is kind of astounding to me. Like, it's not a use I even thought of when I started to work on this. That the public has a very different desire to a certain degree for what this can do for them than what I imagine like a scholarly engagement with it. Yes, please.
So I find this work so exciting, and I was thinking more about just kind of your comments about the philosophy of categorizing data and kind of the discussion we've had as well, and the questions and answers. And just in my own experience working as an archivist and also working with museum databases, obviously it's so important not to reinscribe certain ideas through your categories, but there can also, I've observed a professional anxiety around changing categories in terms of will things be translatable across institutions, or will data be able to be recognized by people not familiar? So I guess I'm wondering if you've encountered that at all with collaborators, with funders, if you think the fact that you're doing this kind of outside of an institution is significant to that. And
well, I think that so I mentioned this so when you're at a Smithsonian fellowship, even your senior fellow, you have sponsors. So I have a sponsor who is a slave ship archaeologist, underwater archaeologist. And I just had a totally blank moment. I'm sorry, this happened. Sorry, can you say that again? I just totally lost my train of thought.
No problem. I guess I'm wondering if kind of in your merging of, if I understand correctly, like pulling in terms
Yes,
of like
okay,
the
yes,
Congress and the MAC, and like if you've received any kind of pushback or
So I
concerns
received
about
no
that.
pushback.
Yeah.
However, what was really interesting talking to this Paul Gordalo, who is my assistant, or not my assistant, my sponsor, he said a lot of people are using their information, which I find really interesting. So other people who are doing Black digital humanities projects are turning to them. Because I think it really is a problem about reinscribing racism into the data. Like, how do we resist that, right? And so he said, oh no, you're not the first person to do this. I keep hearing this every time I talk to somebody. They are looking at our data categories and then merging them into their own. So that to me is interesting. I have not gotten, now it's not that I've abandoned the Library of Congress completely, because there are subject headings, right, that I need. And I use their kind of naming nomenclature, but I also use things like the Getty database on materials is really important, so that we're as accurate as possible about materials, and I use their language. So we're looking at very different kind of systems, and I make that clear, and no funder has ever said to me, oh, you can't do that. And I don't, so that's had not come up. I'll be curious to see if it does in the future. But I do find I'm intrigued that other people are doing what I'm doing, because we're desperate for a different kind of naming system. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I guess a couple of things. So I actually went to Maryland for undergrad.
Oh, wonderful.
And I took one of those African history courses.
Yes, yes.
Way back. This was
Oh, did you really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm a postdoc here now.
Okay. Congratulations.
So that would have been like 2010. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I also worked with Professor Foreman, and I did one of the.
Oh, you did.
I did one of the Black DH, the NEH1 Ken Gallen Angel.
Yes.
So
Okay.
a lot of this is like overlapping in really interesting and exciting ways. So thank you for the presentation. My question is really around the civic engagement interest which you posed, and particularly about responses. And I'd be interested to hear about how you're thinking about sort of the reactivation or the way that these monuments are being engaged, be they through protests, be they through sort of legislation, and how particularly, do you have any thoughts about this particular moment and why these monuments have yet again become these particular sites, and how in the project are you accounting for or thinking about accounting for the protests, perhaps certain monuments are removed, no longer are, like how do you deal with
So the removal is not an issue for me yet.
Okay.
But this is actually something I'm still really trying to figure out. Because I have a monument that I've worked on in New York, the Harriet Tubman, and the most interesting thing about it is that people keep doing crazy things to it. So first of all, it's the swing low. So one of the things that I talk a lot but have not quite figured out how to plug it into here is how do I like include ongoing interaction with the public monument that transforms it in different ways. So this is a monument where someone put one of those pink pussy hats on it. People lost their mind about this. People were furious. And so I actually I copied all of the blog stuff, so I have it. I have all the photographs. But the response from African Americans living in Harlem, they were furious at the appropriation of Tubman in this way. They felt that it was inappropriate, and I thought, wow, this is an inanimate object? I mean, it's really, but the fact that we see it as embedded with her spirit somehow is also very interesting. So I include those photographs in the database, but I could have photographs for every single one of these that's transformed in space. And so I maybe leave that up for a next generation to wrestle with, but I try to include those photographs, and particularly because there's all this discussion. So there's about reclaiming culture space, there's about contested space. This is a really interesting, this monument is super complicated because it is across, so I use things like Google Views. It's across from this brute architecture of the police department. So I do that shot to kind of talk about what does it mean that Alison Saar made a very conscious decision not to include her rifle, the pistol that she often wore, that we know that Harriet Tubman carried, and that given her source image, why did she choose to exclude that? And I think because the monument's right next to the police department. I think there were very conscious decisions. They oriented the monument heading back south, which also you would think okay, so, well, it's because of the subway grate. But can you imagine she was marching facing the police department with the gun on? Okay, so I think some of it are like really like the city is trying to also manage their space and their public image. The monument was installed right at the time. I talk a lot about this visual challenge to the NYPD. It was about that kind of stop and frisk policy that New York City. So I try to address some of this within kind of narrative text. But that changes all the time. But this monument, you would think to me is relatively innocuous compared to some of the other ones I work on, and people were angry at its orientation to the south rather than the north. It's on top of a subway grate. They were restricted by this triangle. I want to say, well, it's the land. Like they got a subway grate and they're wedging a monument in there and it flows a certain way and the traffic lights, right? They're doing all these things to make it most visible from the broadest kind of angle of that street there. But this too is really interesting to me, its relationship to that. And then I talk a little bit about it also, simply put, it's, so I'm trying to address this, but it's hard. This was really actually probably the hardest thing I'm wrestling with, besides sustainability, is how do I talk about the afterlives of monuments in a really, so I want to talk about the USCT Memorial at Lincoln University in this way, with photographs, protesters who are protesting in Ferguson. That's really, so Black Lives Matter shows up in this project in ways I never thought it would. It just does, yeah. Yes?
So actually, sort of following on from this idea that there are things, like there are lines that are drawn where something really is perceived as a kind of sacrilege.
Yeah.
And a discussion I had recently with some of my students in talking about different memorial traditions coming out of different religious traditions.
Yes.
Because she was saying in her new nation, relatively new nation of the United Arab Emirates, there are not memorials. There's like one public memorial, and it's not a tradition, in coming out of her culture and her religion, right? So then we had a whole elaborate conversation about the way in which memorialization and monuments, in Europe and in the States, really come out of a Judeo-Christian tradition, right? And talking about your neighbor going on
Yes.
pilgrimage,
Yeah.
it seems to me that part of how memorials work and how they get used in ritualistic performances, really, I haven't seen many conversations in which the religious underpinnings of those kinds of practices are made very visible. But you had up there sacred and profane space.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you could just say a little more about that.
So Harriet Tubman is really apt for this, actually, because not only is there the new center on the eastern shore of Maryland, right, near Cambridge, but you're meant to basically take a pilgrimage. You're to go from site to site up through Maryland, into Delaware, and into Wilmington, so that you're following the Underground Railroad. But it is in honor of Harriet Tubman, in honor of her work for freedom. Like, it's very explicit on these websites. They don't link it to pilgrimage, and it's so interesting because I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago, about the very notion of communitas and a community that's focused on pilgrimage, of doing together this thing, right, that puts you at a time. And I felt that, I'm about to do this actually this fall with I'm going to give a talk up in Colby or Colgate, I'm sorry, I always collapse those two, but somewhere up there, and then I'm going to drive across the upstate New York over to Canada, partly to see what does that look like to go from site to site to site, because upstate New York is exploiting this as well. This kind of heritage tourism that merges somehow with pilgrimage is really fast, and no one's written a lot about that, but I think the cultural heritage, there's certainly a lot to be said about that. So that will be worked in, actually, with some of the, particularly with Harriet Tubman, there's this really, we're obsessed with her right now. And that you can, the New York Times, how to do it in 36 hours, the Eastern Shore, and hit all the sites, ran a thing about 2 years ago in the Times travel section, right? But I do think it's related to that idea, and particularly because she was such a religious woman. So folks who go to upstate New York every year are part of the AME Church. It's affiliated with a denomination, and it's very specific. They go to the historic home, which I showed you some photographs. They then migrate to the AME Zion Church, and then they go to the cemetery. It's a very, as if one is reliving her death passage, actually, at her house to the church and then on to the cemetery. And when I was at the cemetery, I was astounded at what people were leaving at her grave. they were leaving stones and pieces of glass and flags and medallions, Civil War medallions that showed that she was basically arguing that she was a United States color troop, even though she was a woman and a scout and a nurse. So people are leaving, like intentionally going there, and I saw whole families coming, and it's hushed. There is no running around, there is no playing when you go to these sites. I'm really intrigued by this. Like when they come to the site of her grave, I've actually never quite had this experience of the quietness of families coming out and taking pictures and parents kind of instructing their children on her significance at the gravesite. So I do see, I think it's tied to that, for sure. Yeah.
Right, and I mean, bringing offerings to leave
Of
the site
course.
the icon,
Yeah, exactly. And she is an icon in many ways, right, as well. So. Do you have a question?
I did.
Okay, and then we'll let that be the last one, yeah.
So just briefly, in one of, maybe in the middle of your talk,
Yeah.
you were scrolling past the different kinds of, monuments, I think, that were in the
Yeah.
campus. And I think you talked about, sheet music.
Yeah.
So I was just struck by that because I didn't realize that was,
Well, not really. So what I'm using that is as kind of archival evidence, and that sheet music is Go Down Moses. So I use it because, and I have an audio clip from the 1910s of it being sung, because Alison Sart inscribes it on the exterior of this monument. And so in that sense, I want people to both know what that spiritual is, I want them to listen to it, and it was one of two spirituals that Harriet Tubman used to guide people out of the Eastern Shore to freedom. So she would change the words, she would sing certain passages that would be clues to people where they were to meet when they were to move on. So that, I don't really see sheet music as monument, but it seems absolutely essential to telling that story of this monument. Because over and over we get these narratives of she used quilts to tell stories. Well, we know that actually the patterns that they're talking about were actually post Civil War. So she didn't use quilts to actually to get people to come out, but there was through song and messaging, and sometimes actually she would get people, she was illiterate, get people to write notes. But it is interesting how that song, Go Down Moses, is what you were seeing there, becomes so much part of this monument, right? So I'm trying to, it's not that I can give you this full sensorial experience, but I think sound is part of this. So sometimes what I do is I have a few 360s where I've just stood in the space and walked around so you can hear all the ambient noise, right? And get a sense at least of what's going on in these particularly urban spaces of monuments. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.